Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and this podcast is the first of two episodes featuring ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin in conversation with Dr. Reinhard Brandl.
We're trying to raise the awareness of the people, how important information and cybersecurity is for their life.
Dr. Brandl has been a member of the German Parliament since 2009. He's a veteran of the German Air Force, holds degrees in industrial engineering, and since 2013 has been largely focused on digital policy. In the first of two conversations, Steve will be talking with Dr. Brandl about the broad challenges digitalization presents for the government, at home in Germany and across the globe.
So, Reinhard, we were talking slightly earlier about the overall scope of your different responsibilities, and you were telling me that you're part of the working groups that are responsible for digital policy in Germany. So tell us a little bit about that.
So digitalization is a very broad challenge for governments and also for politicians, and I'm a member of several working groups on digitalization, as well as in my party, as well as in the German Bundestag. So my primary field of focus is the big government IT projects. So there's the IT consolidation of the government's IT infrastructure. We have currently more than 100 data centers on the German federal government level, and we are trying to consolidate them. It's a 2 to 3 billion euro project, and I'm controlling this project from the parliamentary side. Same thing with the consolidation of the networks. We have several wide area networks for the German government. We are trying to consolidate them to one. My second field of interest is military. I'm responsible for 9 years now for the digitalization of the German armed forces. There's a new cyber command. We have a cyber general since 1.5 years. And I'm responsible for building up the structure on the parliamentary side.
I mean, all of that requires you to have a pretty up-to-the-minute understanding of some of the developments and so on in cyber and technology in general. How do you remain current? What are the sorts of things that you do to keep abreast of these sorts of changes?
First, I'm in regular contact with several experts from the academy side, but also from the government side and from companies and organizations like, for instance, the ISF. Second, I'm going to conferences whenever it's possible to meet new people and to learn also from other governments, from other countries, particularly when there are international conferences. And third, I'm reading the press and the relevant internet blogs.
You also told me that you're responsible for the BSI here in Germany. In addition to being an ISF member, they're obviously very active in terms of research and really advising government. So that must give you some real insight into not just the more strategic elements, but also the very practical components of what companies need to be doing. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, and on the parliamentary side, we are very proud of having the BSI. It's quite unique, also in Europe. And I'm working with the BSI on the budget side. We're trying to building up the BSI that we invest a lot of in personnel and infrastructure to have more competences on this side. And second, I'm also working with the BSI because the BSI is responsible for the security of government networks and of government infrastructures. And they are our primary contact for security questions.
Let's move now to look at, in particular, these large global technology players. I mean, clearly you have involvement with them in some of the projects that you've been talking about. But what I'm interested in getting your perspective on is the role that they might have to play going forward. So whether that be in the setting, for instance, of digital policy, for instance, what's your view on how we should be engaging with the large technology players?
From my experience, it should be a project for Europe. So on a national level, we have always problems to find the right regulation for Facebook, for Google, for Microsoft, because we are too small. And, when you create different kind of regulations in Europe, it is also inefficient. And so what we are trying to do is to foster European regulation in this domain.
What specifically do you think the global technology corporations' role might be in creating some of that legislation or policy. I mean, a number of them are pretty keen to try to get involved, and the cynic would say that they want to get involved so they can influence the legislation to favour them. But what's your take on how we should be gaining their commitment, I guess, to some of this legislation?
So legislation is a government issue. It's an issue of parliaments, of governments, and the European Commissions. We should talk to the big IT companies and digitalization companies, but the responsibility for the legislation must stay at the government level. And I'm very skeptical when companies become too much influence on legislation. This normally does not help.
Mm-hmm. So let's dig into that a little bit more detail then. So tell me a bit about your vision, if you like, of the role of government in securing the digital assets of individuals, of citizens.
When we come to the federal level, we are active in several domains. First, what we are trying to do is to promote our label IT security made in Germany. So what we're trying to do is to help German companies and to invest in secure products, as well on the industry side, as well on the production side, also on the IT companies side. And one of our major players in this domain is the BSI, that helps companies to certify the products. So this is one issue we're working on. Second issue is we are trying to raise the awareness of the people about security. So we have several education programs on state level, on federal level, to raise the awareness of people how important information and cybersecurity is for their life. A third issue, we are helping companies to invest in cybersecurity. For instance, on the state level of Bavaria, we have a particular program. It's 10,000 euros. So a company can ask for this program and can ask for this money, and they can get this money particularly to invest in cybersecurity infrastructure. So we're trying to raise the level also of cybersecurity also in mid-sized companies. These are only 3 examples we are working on, but it's a major topic.
Yeah, and that is a very important area, isn't it? The mid-size company, because clearly, whether we're talking about here in Germany or in the UK or most other countries, the largest proportion of business is made up by the mid-size, the small to mid-size companies. And clearly, they don't always have the resources in place, whether that be people or whether it be funding, to be able to implement some of the best practice that is required in order to secure their enterprises. So it's interesting to hear the different initiatives that you have here, particularly in Bavaria. Let's have a look now at some specific legislation, because you talked a little bit about people, but I'd like to really raise this issue of the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, because you mentioned earlier the role of the EU, and clearly this was something that was brought in much earlier this year. What is your sense at the moment on the effectiveness of that legislation so far? And I'm thinking in particular of, do companies fully understand what the requirements might be? Are you seeing some areas where perhaps there needs to be a little bit more work from a government standpoint? Just give me your perspective on how the GDPR has been going down over the last 6 months or so.
So we had big discussions in Germany about the GDPR, because particular small and medium-sized companies were really afraid of the bureaucratic measures they had to take to be in line with the regulation. From my personal point of view, the major success of this GDPR was to raise the awareness of data protection. Because before, we already had Data Protection Act in Germany. And there were rules, and normally when companies followed the rules of the existing laws, the GDPR would be no problem. Mm-hmm. But what we recognized is that there are a lot of companies that were not aware that there are existing data security and data protection laws. And with the discussion about the GDPR, they identified that there's a gap, they have to do something, and they invested in fulfilling these requirements.
And of course, I think one of the interesting things from my point of view is that the GDPR, although it applies globally to European citizens, or indeed the data that's collected on a European citizen, globally we've seen a number of other nations also introduce their own legislation that is at least at the same level. I'm thinking in particular of some of the initiatives in India and Australia, in some of the states, for instance, in the United States. And for me, that can only be a good thing, that we're raising that level of awareness globally. What's your take on perhaps future legislation or future global collaboration? Because it's not something we've been particularly good at within a cyber environment anyway.
Yes, but our first challenge is to harmonize data protection laws within the European Union before we look to India and to other countries far away. So we have a lot of work to do in Europe. In Germany, we have the impression that German tends to over-regulate a lot of things. And I think we are one of the first that have fully implemented GDPR in national law. And there are still other countries that have things to do. So our primary focus should be Europe. And then particularly the link to the United States, because there are a lot of companies there. And the big IT companies come from the United States, and this must be synchronized. So these are our two major challenges for the moment.
So sort out our own house first before we start tidying up everybody else's garden.
That was the first of our two-part conversation with Dr. Reinhard Brandl. Be sure to come back for our second conversation with Dr. Brandl, in which we focus on the more specific challenges of cybercrime.
We have seen several attacks also on critical infrastructure in Germany. They were not successful, but we see that the danger is growing and we have to invest in cybersecurity as well on the infrastructure side as well on the government side.
In the meantime, for more resources for CISOs and anyone looking to enhance the security of their business, please visit securityforum.org. And we'd like to hear from you. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover or someone you'd like us to interview, get in touch through our website or tweet us at Security Forum. Thanks for listening.